another have been hurt over the years by people. Some of you have been hurt deeply and profoundly, maybe by family members, maybe by people at work, maybe by people at church. And it is when that we hurt and when we have been wronged against that the whole area of forgiveness, of course, becomes tremendously challenging. Perhaps sometimes we find it easier in reality to hurt one another rather than to forgive the hurt that is done to us. But the Bible is clear, as I'm sure you know, that forgiveness is one of the hallmarks of authentic Christian living. The Sermon on the Mount includes these wonderful words, which we often find and refer to that part known as the Lord's Prayer by us anyway. Forgive us our debts as we also have forgiven our debtors. Jesus' own words in this Gospel of Matthew earlier on in the 5th chapter, verse 39. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if someone wants to sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. If someone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. You have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you. The Apostle Paul, his letter to the Ephesians, tells us that as Christians we are to be kind to one another. And then he says this, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, as God in Christ forgave you. I'm sure there's not one of us here this evening who wasn't deeply and profoundly moved last week by the commemoration events marking the 70th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. And the BBC and some of the other channels last week had many fascinating programs with accounts from survivors of the Nazis' final solution and the awful expression in the Holocaust. In several of those interviews, I noticed a kind of awkwardness amongst the interviewer of the survivor, as invariably the issue of forgiveness came up. And what was fascinating in many of the instances that I saw last week anyway, they spoke quite openly about forgiving. But the response of the interviewer was very much along the lines, well, how can you really comprehend forgiveness in the face of such suffering and such horror? How can you find it in your heart to forgive those who did such evil and who hurt you so deeply? Earlier this week I was reflecting on this, and I was reminded of a book which I had to read when I was in the 6th form. Maybe some of you had this experience as well, by a very brilliant author, a man called Laurens van der Post. Amongst fantastic books that he wrote a book called Venture to the Interior. He was living in South Africa. And in that book he spoke of his own experience of forgiveness against a backdrop of great difficulty. He had been interned during the Second World War, and he'd had a hard time. But he was conscious that following the awful atrocities during the Second World War, that war crime officers were set up by the British government to make sure that justice was done. He wrote these words, war crime officers who had neither suffered internment or even fought were often more revengeful and bitter about the treatment and suffering we had received than ourselves. And he went on to make this comment. I have so often noticed that the suffering which is most difficult, if not impossible to forgive, is unreal. Imagine suffering. You see, people who have really suffered at the hands of others do not find it difficult to forgive, nor even to understand the people who cause their suffering. They do not find it difficult because out of suffering and sorrow, truly endured, comes an intense sense of privilege. Recognition of the creative truth comes in a flash. Forgiveness for others, as for ourselves, for we too know not what we do. And you might say, well, what was he saying there? He was making this point that when you have truly suffered, there is the ability to forgive, because in that suffering you begin to realize and to understand your own heart. This came home to me some years ago when our son Gareth was involved in a project run by the Holocaust Memorial Trust. He was chosen with another student from the college here to go on a course. He used to go down to Cardiff for a few weeks and learn about the awful things that happened. And then eventually they went on a day trip on a chartered plane from Cardiff, there and back in a day, to Poland to visit Auschwitz. And one of the remarkable experiences that he had, and all the other students, was to sit down and spend time with an actual survivor from Auschwitz. She came to Cardiff, an elderly lady, very intelligent, very articulate. She spoke of her experiences. And then they said, now you can ask this lady any question that you like. And the young people, there were hundreds of them there, all involved in this amazing work that the Holocaust Memorial Trust do. They asked all sorts of questions. And someone asked the question of forgiveness. How do you forgive? How have you come to know how to forgive? And she said, well, in my experience, after being in the camp, we went on this terrible march. Knew it as the Death March. And then she went to another camp. And it was there that the Russians came and liberated this particular camp that she was in. And she said the moment they came through the door, she said many people ran to the gates. But she said, I didn't. I ran to where I knew they kept the bread. And that's what she did. But she said the next 2 days there was a village nearby, and many of the prisoners went on the rampage, for only the better way of explaining it, because they knew that the people in the community knew what was going on. And she had vowed in her heart that the first German that she ever saw, she would murder. It had kept her going, she said. And she went to this house, and their house was empty. They heard a sound, and they realized that under the house there was a cellar. And she and these other women, they broke down the door of the cellar, and there in this cellar was a family hiding. And she had a knife, and she saw, as she moved towards this woman, she said, I saw in her eyes the same look of dread and fear that I had seen in so many people around me in recent years. And she said, in that moment I realized my own heart, and I was able to forgive. That's what Lawrence van der Post was saying. And the point that is made, and the point that I'm making with you here this evening, is a point that Jesus makes very clearly in this parable. That forgiving others comes from knowing our own hearts. Perhaps we are sometimes corrosive with bitterness. Sometimes we neglect to forgive. Sometimes we are insensitive to others. Sometimes we hold grudges. And sometimes we embrace bitterness. But as we do this, it is because we fail to face up with our own hearts. When my father was dying some years ago, I felt it on my heart to apologize to him. I had been a terrible teenager. I really had. I had been a real pain and a real problem. And because we had so much time together, I remember saying to him on one day, look, I'm really sorry for the way I was. I'm sorry for the headache and the pain that I was, 16, 17, 18 in particular. Oh, I don't remember that, he said. And then he said this, listen, I know my own heart, and I can forgive a man anything. That's the point that Jesus is driving us to. The problem that we often struggle with inability to forgive is that we have not recognized the people that we are, and we have not understood our own hearts. You see, in the parable, Jesus, it's prefigured by a question, as so many of them were. This time in verse 21, the question's been asked by Peter. Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother when he sins against me? Up to 7 times? Now, as Peter says this, he's putting parameters, isn't he, on forgiveness. And he does say some things here which are really helpful. For example, he understands that forgiveness is necessary. How many times? He knows that he needs to forgive when he is wronged against. And he also understands that it is often the people closest to us who will hurt us the most. Forgive my brother when he sins. But there is a clear implication in Peter's question that, of course, there has to be a limit to how much we can forgive anyone. At this point in his life, Peter, it seems, is suffering from a legalistic heart and mind. He's interested in numbers. He's interested in how much he needs to do and how much he, by implication, doesn't need to do. He is interested in doing his duty. He is concerned to find out what he needs to do, the bare minimum, as it were, to stay in the right with God. Now, authentic biblical Christianity is exactly the opposite of this. It's not about a structure of rules and details to live within. It's about lives to be lived and rooted in a relationship with God, where the cost is not measured. So Jesus' response is summed up, as we saw in the last verse, that this is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you, unless you forgive your brother, crucially, from the heart. You see, Peter, it's not about how many times you forgive, it's about your heart as you approach forgiveness. Do you know, friends, this legalistic mindset that Peter has, it is so easy for you and for me to slide into it. It creates a seriously defective and destructive state of heart and mind. And ultimately, it wrecks fellowship and unity between Christians, as it inflates the heart with the evil of pride and takes all joy and comfort away. So Jesus has to deal with this. And how does he do it? Well, he replies in verse 22, you want to talk numbers, Peter? Well, I tell you, not 7, 7's nothing. How about 77 times? And you can see Peter straight away struggling. Well, how many, who in the world is going to remember? This is impossible, Lord. And it's at this point he tells this story. Now let me take you through the narrative. It's a parable that is reasonably well known, but maybe some of you are a little unfamiliar with it. And it needs in certain parts a little explanation and, if you like, equating to 21st century values. It says in verse 24 that a man owed 10,000 talents. Now, that was a vast and outrageous amount. In fact, I think the moment Jesus said this in the parable, everyone just fell about laughing. Because what Jesus seems to be saying here is ludicrous and outrageous. In fact, Jesus is using in this parable, which is a made-up story, the technique of exaggeration to make a point. You see, 1 talent was equivalent to 15 years' wages. But this man owes 10,000 talents. That's 150,000 years' wages, or a lifetime's work for 5,000 men. We're told that in the UK, average wage last year was around £26,500. So if you owed the equivalent of 10,000 talents today, and I've done the maths, I make it, and my maths doing is not reliable, so be gentle with me, but I make it at somewhere in the region of £4 billion. You get the picture. Jesus is saying, here is a man who owed far, far more than any man could ever repay. In fact, more than a small country could repay. And that's the point. Obviously, he cannot pay. Obviously, he cannot repay the amount of money. Verse 25, since he was not able to pay. It's obvious. Who can repay an amount of money like this? Now, the consequences of not paying are serious. Verse 25, the master ordered that his wife and his children and all that he had be sold to repay the debt. Well, of course, even that wouldn't repay the debt, but the point was being made, this was punishment. And the man is in dreadful straits. He is in a desperate situation. He can't repay the money, and now not only is he being judged, but his wife and children as well. And so in verse 26, he falls on his knees and he begs for mercy. Crucially, verse 27. And verse 27 is really important. The servant's master took pity on him. There it is. The heart. Cancelled the debt and let him go. And then Jesus turns the tables in the parable. If you like, the boot then is on the other foot. This same man who has been forgiven this astronomical amount sees a man who owes him 100, not talents, but denarii. That's the equivalent to just a few pounds under £5,000. Now, that's still a lot of money, but it's nothing like the 4 billion, is it? And when he sees this man, he attacks him. Verse 28. He grabbed him and began to choke him. Pay back what you owe me, he demanded. And this poor man, although he owes a considerable less amount of money, is in the same position as the man who's now choking him was previously. He too cannot repay the money. And so he begs, as the other man had done in the past, be patient with me, I'll pay you back. But crucially, verse 30, he refused. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison. Now, that isn't the end of the story, because as it often is with servants, some of the other servants, verse 31, saw what had happened, and they were greatly distressed. And so they went and told their master everything that had happened. And when the master hears this, he calls this servant who he has let off the hook for this huge, colossal amount of money in, and he tells him straight away, you are a wicked, wicked man. Why? I cancelled all the debt of yours because you asked me to. Shouldn't you have done the same thing to this man who owed you far less? And then he punishes the man severely. Now, what is this about? This is about the news that those who have been forgiven a great deal are those who then should live lives forgiving others. After all, the occasion for telling the parable is a question about forgiveness. How many times shall I forgive my brother when he sins against me? Up to 7 times? But Jesus' point is this, listen, when you know what you have been forgiven and how much you owe, all talk of numbers goes right out the window. Those who have been forgiven a great deal should live lives forgiving others. Now let me ask you a question tonight. Have you ever owed anyone as much as the first man in the parable? He owed equivalent of 4 billion, by my reckoning anyway. And of course you say, I've never owed anyone as much as that. You say, I've owed people a few pounds in my time. I owed them the building society for the mortgage, a fair bit more, but boy, I've never owed anyone as much as this. But of course, the great thing underlining everything that Jesus is saying here is how much we owe God. We owe him everything, don't we? I was mentioning to the friends in Teguin this morning that sometimes people in life think that God owes them something. Maybe they've had a hard life, a life of suffering, a life of difficulty. And the idea is that because my life has been so tough, God owes me. He owes me a break. He owes me a good day. Maybe he owes me heaven. But of course the message of the gospel is that God owes you nothing. Absolutely nothing. He owes me nothing, he owes you nothing. And yet, owing us nothing, he has reached out to us with everything. That's the gospel, isn't it? What do we find in the good news of Jesus Christ? The one who speaks and talks this parable to us is the same one who eventually will stand before Pilate, accused, and will go from Pilate's throne room to Calvary and to die. What takes him there? Is it the injustice of Pilate's court? Is it the hatred of the Jewish religious leaders? Is it the rabble-rousers in the crowd? Is it the failure of the disciples to defend him? No. Again, the Bible is abundantly clear. It is the love of the Father for you and for me that takes Jesus from Pilate's court to Calvary. And that love, God's love for you, is a love that is totally unconditional. We love God because he first loved us. And when did God begin to love us? When we were rebelling, kicking against him, angry with him, rejecting him, turning away from him. When our hearts were filled with self-love rather than love of God, nevertheless he loved us. I love that parable of the prodigal son. That moment when the father saw him a long way off. There is a sense where that models, doesn't it, God's relationship with us. He has seen us a long way off. And seeing us, he has loved us. Perfect, eternal, unfailing love. You cannot put a price on this. God's love is incalculable in its value. And of course it has its fullest expression in Jesus. That he goes to that cross, having lived that perfect life, a life when he was accused, when he was rejected, as he was mocked, people were cynical about him. But he lived that life on our behalf. He lived it for us. He lived it for you and he lived it for me. And that life of utter, complete, total, 100% holy perfection was then nailed to the cross in agony at Calvary. Do you remember Jesus' prayer as they nailed him to the cross? Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. This is love. The love of God made manifest. You're not a Christian tonight. You hear Christians talk about the love of God. And you say, don't talk to me about the love of God. I got enough suffering in my life, or enough, if I haven't got enough in my own, I've seen enough in the world. And you say, well, how can there be a God of love when all this stuff happens? And where's the proof and where's the evidence that God is love? Proof and the evidence was 2,000 years ago that Jesus, the Son of God, was crucified for rebels and sinners like me and like you. And that on that cross he died, dreadful pain and agony, but more than just the nails and the crown of thorns, the full weight of God's anger towards our sin was poured out on him. That he who never knew what it was to sin once was made sin for us. This is the love of God. This is the mercy of God. And just like the servants in the two incidences, both ultimately, knowing that they are facing a debt that they cannot pay off, all that they do is they beg for mercy. And there is a sense where knowing our own hearts, our own corrupt hearts, our pride, our selfishness, times when we have loved ourselves rather than God, there comes that moment maybe when we realize that we're guilty before God and we beg with God, be merciful to me, a sinner. And what are we promised on occasions when we do that? And what do we find and experience? We find that the God for whom we ask mercy from is a God who is rich in mercy, full of compassion, and who welcomes sinners to himself. You see, friends, Christ came for sinners. He came for broken people. He came for those of us who are damaged by life. But he came for rebels. He came for people like you and me who thumb our noses at the face of God, who stick our fingers in our ears rather than listen to him, who turn to our own way and live our lives doing our own thing. Nevertheless, he came for people like us. He came for the rebellious. He came for the wreck of humanity. He came for the proud. He came for the arrogant. He came for the hypocrite. He came for you. He came for me. And he came because love sent him. And in his coming, we see love manifest. You're a Christian tonight. And you know with certainty and with joy that Jesus came because the Father's love for you. And he went to that cross because of the Father's love for you. And he died in agony because of the Father's love for you. And he was raised from the dead because of the Father's love for you. You owe him everything. Everything. And so when we sing that hymn, we say it with great sincerity. Nothing in my hands I bring. Simply to your cross I cling. And when we understand this, we would not dare bring anything in our hands. For we know that all we can offer him are filthy rags of unrighteousness. And so we run to the cross. We owe him everything. He has given us everything. In a few moments we'll be remembering the life, death and resurrection of Jesus in the bread and wine. And these things speak to us, don't they? They speak to us of holy love, of persistent love. You think of your own experience, those of you who are Christians here tonight, how over the years, times when you really rebelled and you ran away from God. I told you of my own experience, having to apologize to my father. I think of some of the places that I went, the things that I did, and the scrapes and the situations that I got in, and how easily I could have just gone down and onwards in that spiral. But someone pursued me. It was the love of God. And it was the same in your experience. You owe him everything. And so this is Jesus' point in this parable. That when we know our own hearts, when we know just how destructive we can be, and yet how deeply we are loved, when we really understand that, we can forgive. And only then. I want to ask you tonight if you hold anything in your heart still against another human being. Wouldn't it be dreadful if God held one thing against you? It would, wouldn't it? It would be utterly catastrophic. There would be no heaven for you. There would be no joy in this life. If God were to say of your life, I'll forgive you everything, but that thing back there 10 years ago, on that day, at that time, I can't forgive you that. It would be utterly, totally catastrophic. No, you have been forgiven everything. Everything. And so he says to you, now as you live, you forgive. Are you holding in your heart something here? Maybe someone really has hurt you deeply, more deeply than you can express. And yet you're a Christian. I don't want for 1 minute to minimize the struggle of this and the challenge of it, because it is real and it can be very, very difficult. But I want to stress with you tonight this. You are called to forgive, just as Christ has forgiven you. To show compassion to those who hurt you. And to find through the work of God's grace, and it will come, that he provides in the believer a remarkable capacity to forgive. That there might be no bitterness in you, towards another, that you might not carry any grudges, hold no cynicism or a critical spirit towards another. Instead, your life, my life, filled with the love of God and a forgiving spirit that comes from knowing the grace of God. This is what he calls us to. This is the challenge of living Christ-like in our world. And so if you're struggling with this, don't be afraid to come and talk to me. I'd be delighted to encourage you and pray with you. These things are necessary, aren't they? The Bible warns of a root of bitterness. It tells us not to give Satan a foothold in our lives. Whatever you're holding on to this evening, in the light of God's eternal love and in the light of Calvary, let go and forgive. For that is what we're called to love as we have been loved.